Racist cop stops black man, then learns he's the head of internal affairs. The night held its breath, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only small towns and empty roads can conjure. At the edge of this quiet, a gas station stood alone, its neon sign flickering as if it, too, was on the verge of dozing off. Under its dim glow sat a luxury sedan, sleek black and unapologetically bold against the mundane backdrop. Its engine purred softly, the sound a subtle announcement of sophistication. Inside the car, Marcus Thomas adjusted his tie with a practiced ease, his reflection in the rearview mirror catching the faintest smirk. His suit, sharp as a freshly honed blade, seemed to mold itself to his frame. He wasn't a man who needed to flaunt success. It simply followed him like a quiet shadow. Even his watch, a minimalist masterpiece gleaming in the faint light, whispered of success rather than shouting it. Marcus was a man who knew his worth and didn't need the world to validate it. But validation wasn't on his mind tonight. He reached for the coffee in his cup holder, letting its warmth chase away the fatigue of a long day. He was heading home, the promise of peace waiting at the other end of the road. Yet, peace wasn't the only thing waiting. In the shadows of the nearby lot, a police cruiser sat idle, a hunter lying in wait. Behind the wheel, Officer Daniels sipped his own coffee, his gaze locked on Marcus's car. It wasn't the kind of vehicle he was used to seeing in this part of town. The shiny paint, the elegant lines, it all screamed, "Not from here." And in Daniel's mind, that was enough to stoke suspicion. It wasn't about the man in the car. He hadn't even seen him yet. No! This was about what the car represented, or at least, what Daniels had convinced himself it did. Daniels had been on the force for years. His uniform, though clean, bore the creases of long nights and the weight of unquestioned authority. His patrols had become routine, a series of unremarkable stops that often blurred into one another. But tonight, something about this car, a symbol of success where Daniels thought none should exist, felt like a challenge to his unspoken assumptions. He tightened his grip on his coffee cup, as if bracing himself for an invisible battle. In his mind, he was upholding the law, though the law itself seemed secondary to his instincts. Marcus, unaware of the scrutiny, finished his coffee, placed the cup back in its holder, and started the car. The engine came alive with a low growl, the kind that spoke of power restrained by precision. He eased onto the road, his movements calm, deliberate, and unhurried. There was no rush, only the quiet confidence of a man who knew he belonged wherever he chose to go. Daniels watched as the taillights of the sedan disappeared down the road. For a moment he hesitated, torn between reason and the nagging voice in his head. That voice, subtle, insidious, fed on the bias he didn't even realize he carried. That car doesn't belong here. What's a guy driving something like that doing in this part of town at this hour? He set his coffee down and turned the ignition. The cruiser roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. Daniels told himself it was routine, nothing more than a check. But deep down, he knew this was no random stop. Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror and spotted the telltale glow of a patrol car in the distance. He didn't need sirens or flashing lights to know what was coming. His grip on the wheel tightened, but only for a moment. He exhaled long and steady, his expression as calm as ever. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over without cause, and something told him it wouldn't be the last. Hey there, welcome to Noah's Narratives. Today, I've got a story that's as gripping as it is inspiring. Trust me, you'll want to hang on to every word, so don't go anywhere. Quick question before we jump in. Where are you watching from? Let me know your city and country in the comments below. It's amazing to see where this community is growing from around the world. If you're here for tales that touch the heart and spark the imagination, do me a favor, like this video, share it with a fellow story lover, and subscribe so you'll never miss a new narrative. Alright, it's time to bring this story to life. Let's get started. The cruiser's lights flickered to life, flashing red and blue into the still night. The silence shattered as the sirens wailed. their cry chasing after Marcus's car like a predator pursuing prey. Marcus slowed down, his mind already rehearsing the script he'd perfected over the years. He knew the routine, but tonight, something about the air felt different, charged, electric, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Daniels felt a surge of adrenaline as he closed the gap between their vehicles. In his mind, this was still routine, a straightforward traffic stop that would validate his suspicions. Yet, beneath his veneer of authority, a hint of doubt stirred. He didn't know it yet, but the encounter he was about to initiate would change everything, not just for the man he was stopping, but for himself. As the siren screamed and the two cars slowed to a halt, the night seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. The meeting of paths was no accident. It was as if fate had orchestrated this moment, pulling together two men from different worlds to collide under the flickering neon and flashing lights. One sought control. The other carried quiet defiance. Both were about to learn that the truths they carried wouldn't stay hidden for long. The piercing wail of the sirens shattered the calm night, the flashing red and blue lights painting the road in vivid, disjointed strokes. Marcus Thomas, ever composed, guided his luxury sedan to the side of the road with the kind of deliberate grace that only comes from experience. He had been here before. Not this road, not this officer, but this moment. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension, as if the universe itself knew what was about to unfold. Behind him, Officer Daniels pulled his cruiser to a stop, the engine growling like a beast marking its territory. The door creaked open, and Daniels stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel with a rhythm that betrayed his mounting adrenaline. He adjusted his belt, his hand instinctively resting on the holster. Not because there was a threat, but because the gesture made him feel in control. The flashing lights behind him cast a silhouette in sharp relief, a figure of authority cloaked in the unyielding certainty of his badge. As he approached the driver's side, Daniels' eyes scanned the sleek contours of the sedan, his gaze narrowing. He wasn't just looking at the car, he was searching for something, anything, that would justify the stop. The man inside, however, gave him nothing to work with. Marcus sat with an air of quiet confidence, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his expression calm and composed. He wasn't defiant, but he wasn't submissive either. His presence was an enigma, a challenge to the unspoken script Daniels had already written in his head. Daniels cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the hum of the idling engine. "License and registration," he barked, the words more command than request. It was a line he had delivered countless times before, but tonight, it carried an edge, a subtle aggression veiled in the guise of professionalism. Marcus turned to him, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to say, "I see you, officer, and I'm not rushing for your benefit." He reached into the glove compartment with practiced ease, retrieving the requested documents and handing them over without a word. His expression remained neutral, his calmness almost unnerving in its quiet defiance. Daniels took the papers, his eyes flicking over the information with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together a narrative that didn't quite fit. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, his tone probing, laced with suspicion. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady as he met the officer's eyes. "Is that relevant to a broken taillight?" he replied, his voice smooth and unbothered, like water slipping over stones. The question hung in the air, heavier than Daniels had anticipated. For a moment, the officer faltered. The script he had rehearsed in his mind began to unravel, the threads of his authority loosening under the weight of Marcus's unwavering composure. He shifted his stance, his boots grinding against the gravel as he adjusted his tone. "Is this your car?" he asked, his words tinged with implication. Marcus didn't flinch. "It is," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of truth without an ounce of defensiveness. "Registered in my name, as you'll see on the paperwork you're holding." The tension between them grew palpable, thickening the air like a storm about to break. Daniels, so accustomed to commanding the narrative, found himself on unstable ground. Marcus's calm demeanor wasn't just unsettling, It was disarming. Every word, every movement was measured, deliberate, as if Marcus was playing a game that Daniels didn't know the rules to. Daniels' jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The usual power dynamic of a traffic stop, where the officer controlled the pace, the questions, the outcome, was slipping away. He leaned in slightly, his posture stiff with the effort of maintaining control. "You've got a broken taillight," he said, his tone sharper now, as though the statement itself could reassert his authority. Marcus raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I appreciate you pointing that out, officer," he said evenly, his voice calm yet firm. "I'll make sure to have it repaired." The subtle shift in tone wasn't lost on Daniels. He felt the balance tipping further, the invisible line of control slipping out of his grasp. His questions became more pointed, less about the taillight and more about Marcus. The man, the car, the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. But no matter how hard he pressed, Marcus gave him nothing. His responses were precise, factual, devoid of the fear or deference Daniels had unconsciously expected. The flashing lights continued their relentless dance, casting long shadows across the deserted road. The hum of the engine, the faint rustle of leaves in the distance, and the officer's measured breathing filled the silence between their exchanges. Yet, within that silence, a battle was unfolding, a clash not of fists or weapons, but of presence and perception. Marcus leaned back slightly in his seat, his calm gaze never wavering. "Officer," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If this is about the taillight, I provided everything you need. Is there something else you're looking for?" The question landed with the weight of a challenge, forcing Daniels to confront the unspoken biases that had led him to this moment. For a split second, he hesitated, the mask of authority slipping as the cracks in his narrative became impossible to ignore. The night seemed to hold its breath once more, the encounter poised on the edge of something much larger than a traffic stop. Daniels' hand twitched at his belt, his mind racing to regain control. But the man before him, a picture of composure and quiet strength, refused to yield, forcing the officer to reckon with more than just a broken taillight. The night pressed down like a heavy blanket, wrapping the empty road in a silence that amplified every small sound. The faint rustle of leaves, the soft hum of Marcus's idling car, and the subtle crunch of gravel under Officer Daniels' shifting boots. But the most deafening sound of all was the tension between the two men, thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniels' posture, once firm and commanding, began to shift ever so slightly. His shoulders, squared with authority just moments ago, now carried a faint hunch, as if the weight of his own intentions were pressing down. His jaw tightened, the flicker of a muscle betraying the frustration that was slowly breaking through his composed exterior. "Let's try this again," Daniel said, his tone sharper now, cutting through the stillness like a blade. He leaned in closer, his gaze narrowing as it roved over Marcus with a scrutiny that was more invasive than procedural. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was searching for cracks, weaknesses, anything he could latch onto to reassert control. But Marcus remained a picture of calm. He sat as still as a statue, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his expression composed and unreadable. If he felt the intensity of Daniels' scrutiny, he didn't show it. Instead, he met the officer's gaze with a quiet strength that seemed to unnerve him even further. Daniels tried again, his words more clipped, his questions more probing. "Do you often drive this late? Where exactly are you coming from? What's in the trunk?" Each query was delivered with an edge, each one aiming to poke holes in the calm veneer of the man before him. Marcus answered each question with precision, his voice steady and polite, but with an undertone that made it clear he was not to be trifled with. "Yes, I drive at night when necessary. I'm coming from a meeting. And as for the trunk, officer, you're welcome to inspect it if you have a warrant." His tone was measured, not confrontational, but the subtle implication of his words landed like a hammer. It was then that Marcus delivered the question that would turn the tide of the encounter. Leaning back slightly, His hand still resting calmly on the wheel, he asked, "Probable cause, Officer Daniels. Do you have it? Or is a stop discretionary?" For a moment, Daniels froze. The words hung in the air, slicing through the night like the sharpest blade. They weren't shouted or even spoken loudly, but their weight was undeniable. Probable cause. The very foundation of his authority was being questioned, not with anger or defiance, but with calm precision. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The script he had followed so many times before, the unspoken power dynamic he had relied on, was slipping through his fingers. He faltered, his mind racing to find a footing that had suddenly disappeared. And here, dear viewers, is where the story gets really interesting. But before we dive deeper, take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. This is the kind of story that keeps you on the edge of your seat, and we've only just begun. Go ahead, subscribe now, and let's keep the suspense going. Now, where were we? Yes, Daniels was faltering. For the first time, Daniels felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't how traffic stops were supposed to go. The man in the driver's seat was supposed to stammer, to scramble, to defer. Instead, Marcus sat there like an immovable force, his calm gaze peeling back layers that Daniels hadn't even realized he carried. Daniels stepped back slightly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He adjusted his belt, a nervous habit he didn't even realize he had, and cleared his throat. "This isn't about probable cause," he said finally, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. "It's about procedure." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 words. "Procedure?" he repeated, his tone polite but laced with quiet skepticism. "And what procedure, exactly, involves pulling over a driver for a taillight that isn't actually broken?" Daniel stiffened, the color rising to his cheeks. The truth of the moment was unavoidable, and he could feel it pressing down on him, like the flashing lights of his own cruiser. For the first time that night, he wasn't the one in control. The balance had shifted, and he was standing on unsteady ground. Marcus didn't press further. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, a powerful reminder that sometimes the absence of words is louder than the most heated argument. He sat there, calm and composed, as if daring Daniels to find a legitimate reason to keep the charade going. The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced toward his cruiser, as if the glowing dashboard might somehow offer a lifeline. But there was no escaping the reality of the moment. The cracks in his mask of authority were widening, and there was no hiding them anymore. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken truths. The flashing lights continued their relentless dance, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker with the shifting power dynamic. And in the middle of it all, Marcus remained steady, a quiet storm of defiance that refused to be ignored. The air crackled with tension, so thick it felt like the night itself was holding its breath. Officer Daniel stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his face flushed with frustration. The calm, composed demeanor of Marcus Thomas, unwavering, unshaken, had unraveled the thin veneer of control Daniels had clung to. Now, his words came faster, sharper, each one more desperate than the last, like a drowning man flailing for a lifeline. "This can go one of two ways," Daniel snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, but I can call for backup. Don't think I won't." He took a step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots as though even the earth itself felt the weight of the tension. But Marcus didn't flinch. He remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze steady and unyielding. His calm wasn't arrogance. It was precision, a quiet confidence that cut through Daniels' bluster like a blade. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy, and it was working. Daniels' voice faltered as he spoke again, his tone growing less authoritative and more erratic. "You think you're smart, don't you? Driving around here at this hour, acting like you're untouchable. Let me tell you something." But the words trailed off, his thoughts scrambling to finish a sentence that had no point. What Daniels didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that every moment of this interaction was being meticulously documented. The dashcam mounted in his patrol car silently captured every move, every raised voice, every poorly concealed threat. Meanwhile, tucked discreetly into the inner pocket of Marcus's suit jacket, a small recording device whirred away, preserving each word for posterity. Together, they created an irrefutable tapestry of truth, a silent witness to a scene that would later be impossible to deny. And Marcus knew it. Oh, he knew it well. The flashing lights from the patrol car painted the road in alternating strokes of red and blue, their rhythm almost hypnotic. Marcus broke his silence at last, his voice cutting through the charged air with the precision of a scalpel. "Officer Daniels," he said, his tone calm but with an edge that made the words land like a hammer, "I suggest you consider your actions very carefully. Everything tonight is being recorded." The words were a seismic shift, a lightning bolt cracking through the storm of tension. Daniels froze, his breath catching in his throat. His bravado wavered, his posture stiffening in a way that betrayed his unease. His eyes darted toward his cruiser, where the glowing red light of the dashcam blinked steadily back at him, an unblinking witness to his unraveling. For a moment, the night seemed to pause, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Daniels glanced back at Marcus, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The veneer of control he'd worn so confidently just moments ago was now a brittle mask, cracking under the pressure of accountability. What are you trying to say?" Daniels stammered, his voice lacking the authority it had carried before. He shifted uncomfortably, the power dynamic between them slipping further out of his grasp. Marcus leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I'm not saying anything, officer," he replied evenly, his tone measured and deliberate. "I'm just reminding you that accountability is no longer optional. Everything you say and do tonight is on record. So, I ask again, what's your probable cause?" Daniels' face flushed a deeper shade of red, his frustration bubbling dangerously close to the surface. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat, tangled up in the weight of what he couldn't say.